Thank you all so much. I'm delighted to be here. My one hesitation was the title of the retreat. I get it, it's a pun, but a little part of my soul dies inside when I hear the word mantra pronounced as mantra. So I want to suggest an alternative, which a dear friend and mentor suggested to me. And she said that we should call the retreat Men on Pause. Okay.
We didn't pay him to do this, by the way. Just so you know, our budget was low.
So I do want to change the tone a little bit because, as Prabhu said, we're starting in an unconventionally, somewhat intense way, maybe, and to use a kind of overused ISKCON word. This is a heavy start to our retreat together. But that wasn't necessarily my idea. I didn't sort of volunteer to present first, but it just kind of worked out that way. But I think it's important that it did. And here's why. I want to share a quick story with you, if it's okay, that didn't make its way into my official bio. So among other things, yes, I'm a chaplain, and yes, I'm a retired lawyer. But something you may not know about me is that it took me a really long time to learn how to ride a bike when I was a kid. And in the mood of vulnerability, I'm going to ask, can anyone relate to that? Raise your hand if you struggle with learning how to ride a bike. Yes?
I think I was like fourth grade.
Okay, so yeah, maybe I was similar. And one of the things I experienced with many male cousins, all of whom learned how to ride a bike, like, it seemed like as soon as they popped out of their mother's wombs or something. But I experienced, they were like, they kind of, you know, they tore into me a little bit for not knowing how to ride a bike. So speaking of masculinity and masculine tropes, right, there was, I don't know why masculinity is better than riding a bike, but somehow in their minds they were like, come on, like, what kind of boy are you? You don't even know how to ride a bike. So one of my older cousins at one point, maybe it was around fourth grade, maybe a little bit younger, but he decided he was going to teach me how to ride a bike. So he put me onto his like BMX, Huffy bike, whatever it was called. He put me on the bike and he's like, you ready? Okay, I'm ready. And he gave me a big push. You know how to ride a bike that way? Yeah. Sometimes it works. In my case, I went sailing for a while. I was like, this is great, this is great, this is great. And then to a dive. And I landed, where I landed, there was a lot of gravel. So I landed on my hands. And my hands got all, right, scraped up, little bits of gravel, little stones and stuff. So now there's this issue. Right? Of course, not all my cousins flee because they're like, we don't want to get into this. But now there's this issue, right? Do I tell my parents this happened? Now, why am I hesitating to tell my parents? It's not because I let her get in trouble. It was because my mom, who was a nurse for many years, she's retired now, I knew my mom's first thing to do was she would take my hands and she would clean the wound. And cleaning the wound meant what? Pain. I think I heard that someone say the word started with S, maybe? Yeah? No? Sting? Sting? Right? She would like alcohol rub or some kind of, right? And she would clean that wound. And the pain of having the gravel, having the cuts on my hand, and having the gravel still on there, in my mind, paled in comparison to the pain of her cleaning that wound. And so I didn't tell her. I just kind of sort of dry cleaned it on myself and kept it hidden. This is a true story, actually. If you want to, it'll get weird because it'll involve you holding my palm. But if you want to afterwards, you can feel on my right hand, right here, if you feel carefully, there's still a little tiny pebble that's right under that. It's a cool opening to giving a talk, right? But it tells a true story. So what ended up happening was I healed superficially, right? But I healed with the pebble, with the gravel inside. Why? Because I was afraid of confronting, dealing with the pain that comes with cleaning the wound. So why am I telling you this? Anyone want to guess?
It's an excellent segue.
But how is it an excellent segue to what I'm going to say?
We may carry trauma with us that we haven't dealt with until we superficially come about.
We carry trauma we haven't dealt with, we superficially carry it, we superficially cover it up. Look at the subtitle, right? This was actually part of Prabhu's suggestion. My original subtitle for this session was Confronting Toxic Masculinity in Devotional Communities. And part of Prabhu said, well, what if we said healing? And I agreed, but the more I reflected on it, the more I felt like the two go hand in hand. If you really want to heal on a deeper level and not end up with pebbles inside you and superficial healing, and thankfully in this case it didn't do any long-term damage, and it's kind of a funny little story now. Can you imagine, right? Infections and all sorts of worse scenarios. If we really want to heal on a deeper level, we need to confront. And it's going to sting. And it's going to be a little painful, and it's going to be awkward. And for some of us, now this is a very multi-generational, diverse group as far as background, with the practice of Krishna consciousness, as far as identification with Islam, as far as so many things. For some of us, we might hear some things that I'm going to reference that's going to be like, this is like the 100th time I'm hearing the story. Can we move on from this, please? And for others, it's going to be like, why didn't anyone tell me that this terrible, horrible thing has happened in my spiritual home? And that sucks. It feels uncomfortable. It stings. I want to ask everyone from the core of my heart to sit with that discomfort, to allow that discomfort, knowing that we're not just doing it for the sake of being cynical, which I know everyone knows is a weakness of mine. I'm trying to improve and grow from my cynicism. But we're not just trying to be cynical. We're not just trying to, right, get into salacious stories of the past and, oh my gosh, can you believe how crazy it was and this thing happened in 1976, right? We might sometimes reference some of this uncomfortable stuff, but what is our purpose in doing it? Look at that word again in the subtitle, healing. That healing means confronting. Is that okay? I'm sorry, Partha Prabhu couldn't be here, but this is all really kind of inspired by his suggestion that confronting become healing. So to begin, sometimes we chant Mangala Charana. I want to chant, or have us chant a bit of an unconventional Mangala Charana. I just kind of made this up. This is not an actual Bhagavad-gita verse. This is a cut and paste job from two verses, both from the 10th chapter of the Gita. Sattvam sattvavatam aham monam chaivamsi kuyanam. This is Krishna speaking. I am the strength of the strong, and also of secret things I am silence. So strong and silent. In its ultimate sense, from the perspective of bhakti, from the perspective of our Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, ultimately strength finds its perfection and its source where? In Krishna. And any strength that we carry as men, as women, as those of the third nature, as whoever, as embodied beings, Krishna identifies himself wherever there is that strength, he is there. So that's a humbling thought, because no matter how strong we may claim to be, the source of our strength, that the actual strength that's flowing through us as vessels, that's Krishna. That's Krishna in action. That's Krishna speaking out of us. And at the same time, in the name of being strong, in the name of strength, we can do, as we're going to discuss, some pretty disturbing things that can take us much farther away from having Krishna speak out of us. So Krishna says he's the strength of the strong, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every time I'm invoking the idea of strength, that Krishna is there. So this is an invitation to think about strength in a way where Krishna can shine forth through me, or strength in a way where I'm blocking Krishna from appearing. I know that sounds a little challenging. If you want to, we can talk about it afterwards if you feel like that's not And this is my conviction too, that based on how we approach it, strength can either be an opportunity for Krishna to manifest, or it can be something that blocks Krishna. Krishna says, I'm out of here. And so also with silence, right? The secret things. This is one of my favorite references in the 10th chapter, because it's kind of mysterious. And I like mysterious things. So it's hard to kind of explain in the class. Sometimes there's just poetry of it. But of secret things I am silent, right? Of mysterious things, of secret things, of confidential things. When there's that meaningful silence that's held, that's Krishna speaking out of us. But again, that doesn't mean every time we are silent, Krishna is manifesting. When we're silent, when something needs to be spoken, needs to be called out, needs to be addressed, I want to challenge you to think about, is Krishna appearing in that silence? Or is that silence, again, taking us farther away from Krishna? When we feel like we as men need to be silent to our own feelings, to our own inadequacies, to our own weaknesses, to our own struggles, because strong and silent, that's also where strong and silent comes from, right? Some of you may remember this trope, maybe from the 50s, maybe 50s and 60s, but kind of real men, John Wayne type, strong and silent. Is Krishna present in that silence? And I would suggest maybe not. So I want to start with this reference so we can keep our eye on the ball, so to speak, of ultimately, yes, we're concerned with justice, we're concerned with compassion, we're concerned with fairness, we're concerned with, essentially with sattvic qualities, because sattva is ultimately within its material world, it's really the sort of best use of that organ. But as devotees of Vaishnavas, let's remember that the stakes are really high, because this is about Krishna, and Krishna being present or absent in our lives and in our communities. All right, I am saying some things. Let's jump into it. So toxic masculinity. How many of you, just by show of hands, and please be honest, we're creating a safe space, right? This is a safe, confidential space. Can we trust each other? How many of you, by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with this, or you've heard this term recently or in the recent past? Maybe toxic masculinity. Raise your hands. I said aye. Okay. Please raise your hand if you're like, I heard that term. I have no clue. Forget my audience. I have no clue what that actually means. Okay. So, it's the same. So I'm kind of hesitant. Yeah, it's tough, and there's a lot of misconceptions around this term. So I want to use this term very lightly and very fluidly. To be honest with you, to be totally transparent, there's sometimes a value in putting like a buzzword into a title for a talk. So we could just as easily have this conversation without using the phrase, but I thought people are talking about it in the wider world, let's engage with it. But we're going to hold it very lightly. I want to talk about some misconceptions before we get to our working definition. So one misconception right off the bat, I'm going to try to go through this a little quickly. We'll have some time for discussion a little later. One misconception right off the bat is that all masculinity is toxic. Let's call this like a sort of extreme view that look, manhood, masculinity, all of it is just a rotten enterprise from beginning to end. And so as soon as you invoke any kind of idea of masculinity, as soon as the word man appears, it's already toxic, right? That's not what we mean. That's not what I mean to suggest. That's not the kind of message I want to send across. And I don't think it would make sense to dedicate, what is it, two and a half days, 2 days of our precious time and energy if we believe masculinity was just, a lost hope project. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, maybe, and I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but maybe some of you are kind of holding this thought, this misconception right now. Toxic masculinity, isn't that just something that feminists made up to just put down men and disempower and criticize men? Right? Isn't it just a way of attacking men being men? And that's not what we mean. Now, maybe some folks do use it in a much broader sense with some kind of other ideological agenda, but that's not what we mean to address here. Right? So we're not saying that all masculinity is toxic, nor are we saying that toxic masculinity is a total myth made up, buzzword. Before we get to the working definition, another misconception that it's all fine and good out there in the secular world, what used to be called the carny world, before we thankfully, hopefully, retired that term. Did still use the term carny?
You just used it, I never do.
Touche. Another idea. Okay, all right. We can talk about it. Let's talk about it a little bit. But at least whether we use the term or not, sometimes we have this mentality that look, it's us in here, it's them out there. They have a problem with toxic masculinity. We, by definition, can't. Why? Because we know we are not the body. So that's like the trump card. I can't say trump card anymore. That's the get out of jail free card. That's what we have. Not this body, so I don't have to worry about this stuff, right? As we'll soon see, the history, even recent history of our movement, of our institution, of our community, of our relationships. That's an ideal, but are we living out that ideal? We are embodied beings, after all. We have to engage with it. Again, if we're really not this body, then what's the point of paying the big bucks to attend an actual retreat, right? It's just a big scam for this money. So on some level, we are embodied. That means embodied identities, controversial statement in the Hare Krishna movement. Embodied identities matter, make a difference, need to be acknowledged. And if we are serious about a transcendence project, as on some level, I think just by the fact that we're here, we shows we are serious about that project. You can have a transcendence project that also doesn't acknowledge where we're coming from as far as these identities. And so that's a misconception. The last misconception, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, the best way I can phrase it is, the misconception goes something like this. If we have experienced, or if we do experience toxic masculinity in the context of ISKCON, it's the fault of fill in the blank. And that fill in the blank, depending on where we're coming from and our own experiences or our own ideologies, that fill in the blank may be a particular community of folks, right? So real talk, it might be, yeah, we experience toxic masculinity, it's the fault of Indians. It's the fault of Indian culture. It's the fault of those conservatives sitting over there in India who are just mucking it all up. And I know there's some political stuff going on right now in the wider ISKCON world, and these tensions are very real. But I want to ask that we resist that way of thinking, because if we use that way of thinking to just shove off responsibility over there, that's not really working on ourselves. That's not really healing, right? Flip side. If we experience toxic masculinity in ISKCON, it's all the fault of XYZ Maharaj. It's all the fault of such and such sannyasi. It's all the fault of this one thing that happened in 1975. Now there are sort of historical occurrences that are important to acknowledge, but it's overly simplistic and dangerous and just irresponsible to pin all the blame particular individuals, particular cultures or ethnicities. There's some folks that would fill in that blank with Srila Prabhupada. We don't necessarily hear a lot of voices because a lot of these folks don't identify with this community anymore if they once did. But again, while we can sympathize with perhaps why someone would feel that way, it's not very helpful or constructive. Is that okay? Any other misconceptions that anyone wants to throw out real quick before we move on? Yes? That Krishna is the only male. Tell us more. So you're proposing that as a misconception, yeah? So that's an interesting one, right? Because that is in one sense rooted in our theology, right? We do have this sort of it's a very deep subject, but this theological sort of radical statement that says essentially that all Jivatmas are in the feminine position and Krishna is the only true male. And there's this famous story which I won't get into of supposedly with Jiva Goswami and Mira, which kind of a cool exchange about that. So that is a that's a theological principle. How does it get turned into a misconception for us?
Leaning on that fact and using it to bypass thoughts.
Thank you, Richard. Chris? Thank you. Chris Prabhu makes an excellent point, right? We can take a kind of really deep esoteric theological principle like that and, as you said, lean on it in order to perpetuate toxic masculinity. Well, I don't need to worry about this again because Christians are female, we're all female, whatever, right? So let's use, I apologize, it's a bit wordy, but let's use a working definition, and again, we're going to hold it lightly. If it resonates with you, great. If it's an opportunity to reflect, we want to use this definition as a way to reflect more honestly and more deeply on ourselves, collectively and individually, and our shared and individual responsibilities. If it helps you to do that, great. If it's not resonating with you and it doesn't help you to do that, every time I say toxic masculinity, just replace it with unhealthy masculinity or non-Krishna conscious masculinity. Because what I want to argue is toxic masculinity is actually kind of really the antipode to the true Krishna conscious masculinity. But here's our working definition. Can someone read this out for us? Sean, can you read that out for us?
Toxic masculinity is a cultural phenomenon in which manhood is defined through exaggerated displays of power and dominance, sexual virility, devaluing the feminine, and emotional stoicism. It generally results in harm to society, particularly by engendering chauvinism, misogyny, and violence, as well as self-harm to men through setting unrealistic expectations and stunting emotional growth.
So I know that's a lot. We're going to spend the rest of our time together sort of unpacking this. A lot of this language comes from other secular sources outside of our tradition, but I want to kind of bring it home for us a little bit in the rest of the presentation. A quick note on this word toxic or toxicity. Can someone give me a quick sort of off the top of your head definition of toxic?
Poison.
It's toxic. Poison. That's usually the word that comes to mind. Poison is the first definition. We can look at toxic masculinity in that way of being something that's poisonous, something that, again, there can be degrees of. Something can be more or less poisonous, something can be more or less toxic. So I also don't want us to think about this as an all or nothing, especially if we're reading something like this and going, well, that's the most terrible, abusive guys out there. I'm enlightened. I attend mantra. I got my free T-shirt. I mean, we're still doing free T-shirts, right? No.
You didn't read it.
Oh, sorry, I left my car. Right? But I'm a part-carrying member of mantra, so I don't have to worry about this. I'm not toxic. Instead of thinking of it as a sort of zero-sum, either you are or you aren't, like with poison, like with something unhealthy, maybe we can think of it in terms of something that can be incremental, where they can be more or less. And what we want to do, in one sense, as embodied being, as men, as holders of male ego, which is an interesting kind of concept, we arguably all have a little bit of toxicity in us. If we didn't, we probably would be in the material world, right? We all have stuff we're working through. We all have this poison at the anarthas within us are like poison. Like Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in his exegesis or his explanation of the different pastimes of Krishna dealing with the demons, and then also with the devatas like Indra and Brahma. Bhaktivinoda Thakur gives this analysis, how each of these demons represents different arthas within us. And in a way, I don't want to take us too much of a tangent, but in a way we can think about toxicity like that. Each of these demons represents a certain kind of toxic, I would even say a sort of toxic masculine attitude. Push and I were talking about this, but I can't help but geek out on it a little bit, so I'm just going to say, obviously the one example that comes to mind, maybe the poison, and Krishna, and Kali. So Kali is the natural sort of mascot of toxic stuff, toxic masculinity. But the example that I think is kind of a polar example in some sense is Indra. With the lifting of over, right? Because when Indra, Indra's a great soul, a great personality. You don't get to occupy that post unless you've really kind of done your homework and you're a good dude. But Indra, in that episode, just think for a second what he does, right? And where it's coming from. He responds to Krishna's challenging his authority in a completely, insanely disproportionate way. But just think about that for a second. I know we're used to the story. Take a step back. It's bonkers. It's a totally disproportionate response. It's like, you insulted me, I'm going to destroy your village and every living being in it. This is a day ago, right? It's kind of weird to think about and almost like a little dark to think about, but who was Indra trying to kill? He was trying to kill, maybe Krishna, maybe the cowherd men. He was trying to kill children. He was trying to kill women. He was trying to kill cows and calves. How did he get to that place? What kind of emotional state was he, we might say, triggered into by Krishna's supposed insult to him, right? There's a way, again, to paint it. I know it's a bit of a stretch. I'm going to work on this and maybe try to write a paper on it or something. But I would suggest there's something very kind of there's toxic masculinity at work, where Indra's pride is wounded. We're going to talk about this, but he goes to displays of power and dominance in other pastimes, other stories with Indra, the sexual virility piece that gets him into trouble a lot. There's a devaluing of the feminine. And not so much the emotional stoicism part, but we'll talk about that. But I would say, right, there's a way of reading these pastimes, these leelas, that yes, it's about Krishna kind of performing and acting his eternal leela, but there's also lessons in there for us, and these lessons have to do with drawing out the poison from our hearts. Does that make sense? Still with me? Any questions about this before we move on? Either about this working definition, updated toxicity? Yes, Prabhu. Stoicism. The meaning of Stoicism. Yeah, can anyone give us a quick definition of Stoicism? Not as an actual philosophy. There's a philosophy called Stoicism, but the way we use it is more like
Stuffing your feelings.
Stuffing your feelings, putting on a brave face, not showing your emotions, not communicating your emotions. Okay. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, misogyny. Yes, we're gonna unpack that. Misogyny, the most literal definition, is hatred of women. And what's implied by that is usually not just like hatred of particular women, like, man, I really hate that woman that cut me off, but hatred of woman or feminine as a kind of category. It comes from the Greek, miso is hate. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I was just going to say, there's maybe a broader range in this between emotional stoicism and toxic masculinity that is uncontrolled emotions or rage. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So some people are going to suppress the emotion or not be in touch with emotions. Other people display this toxic masculinity by unfettered emotional rage or anger. So.
Yeah, great point. Right, so it's the extremes. It's the two sides of the same coin: the attachment, aversion, and adaptation. Either I'm going to bottle it all up, or I'm going to just rage out in this, again, disproportionate Indra, destroy the village way. Interesting thing, and you don't have to volunteer if you experience this personally, maybe we've all experienced this personally, but isn't it true that the very same people who bottle up our emotions are often the very same people who, when it reaches a certain point, do rage? The two are not mutually exclusive either. It's just a matter of time, sometimes you very, and it comes out in some like totally extreme, disproportionate way. Okay, let's move on. I know I have a lot of ground to cover, so unfortunately we're not going to get to go so in depth all the time. But I want to look through these four. So this framework of four characteristics, 4 characteristics that sort of define for us or mark for us toxic masculinity. And the very first, it's sometimes surprising that this order is intentional. The very first one we want to talk about is, in some sense, also the most subtle one. So toxic masculinity, Prabhu, would you read that for us?
Conflates strength with power, dominance, and aggression.
So this idea, often unspoken, often assumed, that strength equals power, or displays of power, exercises of power, dominance, aggression. We can add to this list. What other words can you think of in a similar vein? Control is a, control is a big one. Control. Possession. Yeah. And I think often of in terms of like winning, losing, defeating, right? We're going to talk about this. That conflation of strength, that almost automatic, insidious conflation of strength with these things, that's kind of a hallmark of, or a foundation of toxic masculinity.
Well, also, killing. Another word.
Killing.
That comes to mind.
Yeah.
I mean, these kind of imply that without saying it.
Right. Sometimes they actually say it too, like in slang. I mean, again, that's not to say suddenly everyone's going to like watch what they say. I mean, natural kind of language evolves and changes. But did you ever notice that we say something like, oh, he killed it? Did you hear that? Man, I killed it. He just killed it. It's a very masculine way of thinking about here. Yeah. But like, it's funny how, you can take a hunter out of the forest and put him into a Hare Krishna ashram, but a language finds its way there anyway. And I think of this also, but like, so let's think of the image. Actually, let's just do this as a quick exercise, okay? Close your eyes. That's the first challenge, because I don't know. No, close your eyes. And you too, close your eyes. And picture like an amazing, inspiring, like made you soar type of kirtan. Can be a specific one or just an imagined one in your head. Favorite kirtan is whatever. Okay, open your eyes. What kinds of images popped into your head? Dancing? Okay. Dancing is an interesting thing, right? Because in a lot of cultures, dancing is very much equated with feminine stuff. And we got this whole interesting sort of practice. Sometimes the men are more into dancing than the ladies are. But dancing, what else came to your mind?
Heat.
Is it from New York?
Singing very loudly. Lot of passion.
Volume. Volume, quicker. Turn the volume up. The louder the better. The louder, the more potent your kirtan is. Jay Vegas only has some thoughts about that. He doesn't quite agree. But right, sometimes it's volume, which means why have 2 redundants when you can have 7 redundants, right? I kind of grew up going to the Brooklyn Temple in New York, so you can see where some of my kirtan sanskars come from. Splendid! Again, I'm not making on kirtanias by any means, but it's funny how even subtly we have all this equating all this real masculine energy and imagery that has to do with power, dominance, aggression. Not always a bad thing on its own, but let's take a deeper look at this. So one of the ways that this ends up coming up for us in our history, and we're going to get to some discussion of contemporary examples, is when you start reading and researching, as I did in preparation for this, sort of cultural shifts in ISKCON, you often hear this narrative. Now, I'm not saying this narrative is 100% objective, like everything is subjective, everyone has their own sort of memories, their own takes on things. But often, and some of you in the room maybe it was bad for some from your own personal experience, but there's this narrative you often hear, especially from older devotees, especially from the really, early day pioneering devotees, thinking of like Mukunda Maharaj, for instance, who in his role when I got to work with a little bit. You often hear this narrative, right? In the really early days, the metaphor, the imagery, the analogy that was most often used to describe the up-and-coming little Hare Krishna movement that became a Hare Krishna explosion. Again, interesting language, explosion. But what was the metaphor, the analogy that was often used in those early days?
Family.
Say again?
Family.
Family. Almost always you hear devotees talking about family. We were like a family. Now, not only early pioneering devotees, in a certain context, kind of shared with Prabhupada his missing those old days, those early days. Now, Prabhupada in different ways would respond at different times, and sometimes Prabhupada might respond by offering a little bit more of a detached view or saying something a little bit more like, they're all good days, or no old early days, or no. But in this instance, Prabhupada, very much connecting to Guru Das Prabhu in this way, Prabhupada agreed. And his response was yes, before it was a family. And when this, I don't know the exact date, but when this exchange took place, this was about a time where the movement was expanding very quickly and very robustly. And with that expansion came a lot of shifts. One of the major shifts, which devotees often talk about, is intimacy and connection to Prabhupada himself and access to Prabhupada. Right? Particularly women, but also other devotees. Right? Suddenly it was sort of an inner circle and everyone else, and so there's that dynamic. And so that's part of it. But something I want to focus on for our purposes is there's been a shift also in the metaphor. So whereas the early days was very much analogized to a family, as ISKCON grew and grows and expanded and expands, we seem to have traded in the family metaphor for other metaphors, for modalities of, and this is taken from an essay by the late Krishna Swami and Krishna Maharaj that they published in 2004. But they say the shift from family became a shift from a more feminine family metaphor to the modalities of warfare and business. Where suddenly the expansion of the Krishna movement is talked about in terms of conquering. And sometimes Prabhupada would use this language too, so I'm not trying to make, judgmental statements about what's better or worse, but this is just an observation. More and more, there's this language of conquering, of conquest, of victory, of power, of domination, or a more mercantile business, sort of, being successful in terms of salesmanship, right? Overtaking the competition. Those things tend to have that more, again, speaking in generalities, more of a masculine flavor. Think about a family. We're traditionally in almost all old world cultures, we're the holders of the family. We're the ones who really are the rock of the family. It's almost always the women, the mothers. So, and Prabhupada, in many ways, although Prabhupada was often talked about as a grandfather, he was also likened in some ways to having like the heart of a mother. Right? That famous line about the heart of the Bengali mother. So there's that shift. In the year 2000, the late Bhakti Swami sent a very powerful email following the GBC meetings in Mayapur. Some of you may be familiar with this. He sent it, I believe, to the entire GBC. And it was an honest and earnest, heartfelt reflection on where Bhakti Maharaj saw the roots of the problems that were plaguing ISKCON. If you think back to 2000, for those who were familiar, it was a time of transition, big time of transition. This is what Bhakti Maharaj had to say. He said, if we just go back and reflect on our last Mayapur meeting, our major problems that we've all had to deal with were all leadership oriented. For example, abuse of philosophy, abuse of financial resources, abuse of children, abuse of women. Now here's the kicker. He said at one point in the meeting, in 1 hour's time, just for 1 hour of multiple day meetings, he said he counted approximately 15 terms that were all battle tactic terminology, wiping out the opposition, attacking, destroying them, our plan of attack, eliminating the competition, right? Getting something on this person. And Bhakti Maharaj's reflection was, we were spending most of our energy in this combative mentality. So I wanted to start here, and I want to open it up for some discussion before we move on to the next point of toxic masculinity, because in some sense, even though this is the most subtle, this is really arguably the kind of the root. If we are locked into this kind of this paradigm where strength equals power, equals domination, equals being a warrior of sorts, there is a line that can be drawn to so many other very subtle and sometimes not so subtle impacts that can take us to places of abuse, that can take us to places of exploitation, that can take us to places of misogyny and chauvinism, which we'll talk about. But before we move on, we talked a little bit about the past, and there's more examples we could give. I just wanted to focus in on that one that Bhakti Swami Speedall was so on point. I just wanted to share that with you. But I have a question for you all. How do we experience dominance and aggression in devotional communities today? And I want to just establish some norms. We don't want to talk about particular individuals by name. It's not about sort of vilifying anyone in particular, but let's honestly reflect on how do we see this at work for us today. We're kind of half-joking, talking a little bit about that Kirtan imagery. But are there other examples that you all have experienced or can draw from where you see this at work?
So if everybody's listening to me, I should just be louder.
Okay, so it's kind of like correlation. If you're louder, they'll listen to you.
The idea that if no one's listening to you, you need to just be louder.
So, practically speaking, sometimes you do need to be louder, but think about subtly what we tell ourselves, especially as men, what we internalize, a lot of this is internalizing, what we internalize. If I want to be heard, I need to be the loudest and I need to speak sometimes over the other person. And we see that in our devotional communities. Yesterday.
Aggressive judgment of newcomers.
Aggressive judgmentalism of newcomers towards newcomers, right? Being really harsh, judgmental. What a shift from this sort of paradigm of radical hospitality that our own theology and our scriptures really highlight for us, right? But instead we can kind of take this very aggressive, judgmental, harsh view of newcomers.
Some argue quite strongly that the success of our movement and the progress of our movement is increasing the dominance of men over women. And that if women are empowered, this is actually blocking our ultimate goal of their perception of Vedic idealism.
That the very goal is for men to dominate.
It's a symptom of the proper social structure.
We're going to, I think that'll come up a little bit later also in terms of this entrenched misogyny, because it sounds like that's kind of butting up against that, right? But even, yeah, that whole assumption very much rests on this idea of dominance. It also rests on a kind of a, what's the term for it? Zero sum or either or mutually exclusive, right? In other words, it can only be one winner, it can only be one on top. What about the paradigm of we lift each other up, right? Whoever with kids.
I was thinking of aggression in terms of how we view other religious traditions and other organizations, other samudayas, it's always a struggle in my mind to discriminate how, what's the difference between like toxic vandalism and real heart-to-heart spreading the words.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, right? There's something about this aggression in terms of evangelism, which again often looks at it as a us, them, they are our rivals. We have to put them down to boost ourselves up, right? We are the best there, right? That's one modality of outreach or evangelism or missioning. There are others. And yeah, that's something I think we need to explore.
When there's insensitivity to the needs of the quiet ones or the unrepresented ones, that is a type of aggression, maybe not in the traditional sense, but in the sense that power makes silence as a tactic. Keeping people silent because there's no avenue or there's repercussions. So that's a very strong sense of what you're asking for your down.
Yeah, right. Who gets to say? Who has the power? And what does that also do to those of us who, by nature, maybe are more quiet, more reflective, more contemplative, slower to speak, and more reflecting and ruminating. I remember years ago, something with Prabhu, which some of you may know, and I feel comfortable using his my name because I previously he said it quite often. But I remember something he said many years ago that just really stuck with me. He said, "This movement can be a terrible, terrible place for introverts." And I was not very exciting.
So what I would say is that what I have experienced and actually observed also between newer devotees versus more established, and that's not in a very widespread case, is that holier than thou kind of attitude.
Yeah.
Right? I'm here longer, I'm more established, I'm higher on the devotional plane than you. So I get to exert this influence or dominance over you. So it's kind of natural in some ways, but it is there. Maybe not so widespread, but
it's there. Did everyone hear Prabhu's point? The sort of holier than thou attitude that often comes with perception of seniority, a perception of, you're a newcomer, I've been around, right? The old, I don't know how much of a thing it still is, but at least when I was coming up, the thing, the kind of funny way of measuring or talking about this was when the key lamp got passed around, so it was in order of seniority, and there was like always this kind of tension around like, wait a second, he was initiated 6 months after I was, like, that's not cool, maybe that, that kind of thing is not so much prevalent, but in subtle ways, we kind of locked into this like pecking order type of thing, which can be again a very sort of masculine, dominant, aggressive kind of modality. We'll take 2 more here, and then
I just want to say that when you're talking about the greatest devotee, I think some people say Shiva is the greatest devotee, Radharani is the greatest devotee. And I hear this too much, and I don't like it, God is God and Krishna is God. And why keep so hell-bent upon who's the greatest devotee? Radha Shri say Radha is the greatest devotee. And God Shiva is the greatest devotee, say God Shiva is the greatest devotee. I don't care who's the greatest devotee. God is God and God is Krishna, because Krishna is God, Jesus, and it's fine. I think it's not really, I don't experience anything. Internally, I am a little unhappy with, hearing this all the time in the temples, and, so I just feel that I just want to hear what goes on and what is the justifications.
Sort of like you a little too late, but I'll summarize it. Sort of what I'm hearing is a kind of what can become like almost like a fixation or obsession on ranking, on best and worst, first, second, third, right? Which I think is a very linear way of looking at things. And in our tradition, often we'll have, this is the best, and this is also the best, and this is perfect, this is most perfect, right? So, yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to say, echo Mitchell's point, I think sometimes the truth can be sort of assumed a priori to be correct. This is the conclusion, everyone has decided this, and there's no actual live intellectual discussion that happens, as if we've lost our brahminical society, where people can have healthy debate without wanting to hurt each other. So that's something I've experienced a lot.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, building on Prabhu's point, right? The fact that we've, collectively kind of bought into this like dominant mindset makes it really difficult and sometimes practically impossible to feel safe, to have a healthy flow of ideas and debate, which, at least according to the ideal sense, is what, as you said, rabbinical culture is supposed to be about. Right? So we're going to move on. There's more we can say about this. So this is really laying the groundwork. This is a very long quote. I'm not going to read the whole quote. But what I want to point out is this is not lost on people. So it's a bit of a challenging quote. Some of you may know this individual that's being quoted as his initiated name was Shubhananda. a long-standing ex-convictee for many years, and ended up parting ways with the institution. He wrote a very powerful essay, I thought, called On Leaving Islam. And one of the things that he identifies is exactly this, what he calls the obsession or power, control, order, hierarchy, the chest-pounding martial rhetoric. And again, I think it's, while it's easy to write off, well, people who left, whatever, who cares what he thinks. But it's a challenge for those of us who are trying to make these devotional communities work and learn from our own mistakes and safeguarding against these things. It's valuable information for us. So I just wanted to share that it's noticed and people are affected by it. I like, again, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I like that he asks this question rhetorically: what about the beautiful feminine qualities that Lord Chaitanya and his followers? And it's okay with the organizers. I can share the presentation later with anyone who wants it. But I like that he asked us, what about all these qualities of humility, of empathy, of love and compassion? And if you look at our Shastra, if you look at Chaitanya Lila, it's heartbreaking, it's heartbreaking. This is what Mahaprabhu's total mood is. And yet, a movement that's supposed to be dedicated to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, sometimes we can cultivate almost the exact opposite mood. Okay, second point. We're going to move a little bit faster. The second point is this idea that toxic masculinity uses a kind of an exaggerated form of sexual virility, or an exaggerated concept of sexual virility, sexual prowess, or its flip side, celibacy, as a metric for manhood. So the celibacy piece is not so often discussed in secular circles, but I feel like it's really relevant for us. This is what one scholar calls sexy celibacy. And celibacy or monasticism or renunciation is kind of the flip side of this sort of fixation on sexual prowess and virility. No, this is not me bashing if you're in saffron. This is not me bashing the saffron-clad monastics. It's not about that. But I think we can all recognize collectively and individually these inclinations can be there, where we can approach either sexual activity, enjoyment, engagement in an unhealthy or toxic way through excessive attachment, indulgence, and exploitation. And we can also approach celibacy or renunciation in this unhealthy manifestation of aversion, rejection, vilification. So again, a number of examples from our history, and so I apologize if this is disturbing to anyone or if this is new information for anyone. But in our movement's history, we've struggled with things like attempts to institute polygamy, some of which Srila Prabhupada happened during Srila Prabhupada's lifetime, that Srila Prabhupada himself made pretty clear his opposition to, while also hearing out the various arguments. But the fact there were repeated attempts, both during Prabhupada's time and even after Prabhupada's time, and in some respects may even be continuing behind closed doors to this day, tells you something. Also what folks call serial monogamy, in other words, right, going from one monogamous relationship to another in succession. And there's all sorts of, I'm not going to get into details, but there's all sorts of like outrageous stories in history of that. Horrific exploitation of women on Sankirtan, to the point that there was, and please correct me if I'm misspeaking, anyone who's more knowledgeable about this, but to my understanding, the GBC had to actually have a resolution on the books denouncing the philosophy that the male leader of the Women's Sankirtan Party was her, I think the phrase used was eternal husband, and therefore could in essence could enjoy with her sexually with every woman on that party. Right? This is like, yeah, not pleasant to look at, to think about. I wish we didn't have to talk about it, but it's important to contextualize and keep that history. The idea of within marriage of what we might consider rape, men forcing themselves on women in the name of they have their wifely obligations or duties to satisfy, their lusts and their cravings, Or in some cases, devoting and frequenting prostitutes because, well, that's the more Vedic way of doing it, rather than to pollute my wife, I'm going to go, right? Fall downs, affairs, and of course, in its grossest manifestation, sexual abuse of women, abuse of children, right? Now let's look at the flip side, or the other manifestation of this, and that is when renunciation becomes so linked and aligned with power, with dominance, with this kind of very strong, almost weaponized rejection of women and aversion to women, then renunciation becomes a form of social capital and power. We saw this in the movement's history, where at a certain time, to take sannyas was ostensibly about monasticism, but it was also about holding power and position, right, and influence. And coming along with that, contempt for women and for men who are perceived as hand-packed men. Right? So there's a lot of hatred directed towards not just men in particular who are perceived to be hand-packed, but the idea that all grihastas, by dint of being grihastas, essentially were fallen. Derogatory language, which we'll talk about in a bit, right? But suddenly objectifying. When you want to attack someone and feel better about yourself when you do it, the very first step you need to do is you need to depersonalize them. Because if they're a person, you can't really hate on them. But if they're an object, if they're an animal, if they're something less than, okay. So what do? You depersonalize. You strip away their identity. And so instead of being ladies, instead of being sisters, god sisters, they become Maya deities, they become witches and tigresses, they become hot stool. I mean, it's shocking to me that that was once a thing, but apparently it was. Taking sannyas, abandoning women and children very whimsically. Look at, I want to invite, I want to beseech you, I know we're running short of time, I don't want to take too much time on this, but please read in the Chaitanya Mangala, if you haven't already, please read the description of Mahaprabhu's taking sannyas. Grown adults, so it's grown men, if I can say that, as grown men, adults, we have wept reading this. It's such a heartrending description of what Mahaprabhu's taking sannyas was, what kind of sacrifice and anguish. And if you look at the Chaitanya Mangala, which Nas Thakur makes it, so beautifully describes this final meeting between Mahaprabhu and Vishnupriya, right? That's our model of taking sannyas. Contrast that with this unfortunate history of men essentially abandoning their women and children whimsically and out of a sense of a quick shortcut out of their responsibility and into power and prestige, right? And there's the history of this. And of course the erasure of women, the erasure of women's voices, the erasure of women's bodies from physical spaces, women no longer being allowed to be in temple rooms, women no longer being allowed to lead kirtans because of taking out of context some admonitions against renunciates hearing the singing of women. Which we'll unpack a little bit. I wanted to speak about this because, and again, I want to be very sensitive about this. Again, it's not, let's resist that urge to play the blame game and just say, well, this is all so-and-so Swami, right? But there is a very interesting history where in the mid-1970s, and then coming to a head in 1976, I believe, where there was this great controversy that became called, and I think Prabhupada himself called it, a fratricidal war within ISKCON. And the fratricidal war within ISKCON was between, a sense, the sannyasis and brahmacharis on one hand, and grihastas and women on the other. And the sort of framework for this, the idea for this was, as you can see in some of these images, right, this explosion of sannyasis. So you see this picture of Prabhupada walking all at Dundas, Prabhupada surrounded by his circle of sannyasis. The Radha Damodar Traveling Sankirtan Party, which some of you may have had personal experience with. One of the things, I'm not saying the only thing that was happening there, but one of the things that was happening there, we know this because people who were involved have told us this and have written about it. One of the things that was happening was sannyasis preaching, actively preaching to men, particularly brahmacharis, to leave temples, to reject their grihastha authorities as being fallen, as being in Maya, and to join the party. So you have this party or parties expanding like anything. On paper it looks great. Behind the scenes, it's decimating the movement, it's cannibalizing the the movement. It's leaving grihastas demoralized, it's leaving temples practically, right? Another was shaking his head vigorously and showing us some stories to tell, right? This really happened. I want to share this by name because Tamal Krishna Maharaj is often cited as the sort of main instigator of this, and he's taken responsibility for that. One of the things I think is so amazing about Tamal Krishna Maharaj, and that really helps me to respect him, is the fact that in many ways he took ownership of that. And later in life, before his untimely departure, he wrote about it, spoke about it. So he shares this little snippet where he talks about, he says, the sannyasa is on myself as much as any others, viewed women as Maya, viewed grihastas as Maya, and shared our wisdom with the brahmacharis, and told them to avoid the association with women, grihastas, right, Krishna. And when they brought this to Prabhupada, what was Prabhupada's response? Fanaticism. He declared fanaticism. He put it into it.
Any sense of all Krishna must be found.
Any sense of all Krishna must be found. I mean, yeah, enough said, right? This is, another controversy that I think is interesting for us is, as I said, there are statements that are part of our tradition that renunciates should not hear the melodious singing of a woman. You know, scholars really generally understand that within the tradition to be more, a woman in a solitary place, singing, kind of sensual experience. But one way that it manifested in ISKCON was, whereas according to most narratives, in the early days of ISKCON, where women were encouraged to, by Prabhupada himself and by early ISKCON leaders, were encouraged to lead kirtans, there came a time where women were not just discouraged, but in some cases banned. And one interesting incident was a particular temple, I don't recall the temple, but a particular temple where the temple leadership wrote to Prabhupada with their proposal that Govinda, the recording of Govinda not be played, the greeting of the deity, and instead that a recording of Prabhupada himself be played. And they laid out their argument how it was disturbing to the brahmacharis. Prabhupada was in Vrindavan, from what I understand, when he received this letter, and he fired back a response, and his response essentially was, why are you always changing things? It's kirtan, it's a chorus, there are many people singing. We are doing this in Vrindavan, we're playing this in Vrindavan in front of the deities, and it's good enough for us, so why is it not good enough for you? I mean, he was like, and I don't think it's mentioned in that particular letter, but in similar exchanges, because unfortunately it's just something that happened repeatedly, Prabhupada also made some famous statements saying if the men are disturbed, the men should move to the forest. Right? In other words, Prabhupada's saying, and I like this quote here, which comes from a letter to Garden Way, where Prabhupada made the same point. If you are disturbed men, the onus is on you to as Prabhupada said, become steady in Krishna consciousness. To be steady in consciousness. You work on yourself. If you're disturbed, that's a sign. It's something not right with me. You don't shift the blame to the object of attraction or aversion. Right? This is Prabhupada's quite revolutionary stance. And so in this instance, his beloved daughter, Yamuna, leading this, and I love this photo of her from the recording session. But Prabhupada not just kind of tolerated it, but he was so proud of her and so proud of those devotees that he practically instituted as a cultural practice for our entire movement the celebration of this wonderful musical offering. And he wouldn't back down from it. Similarly with Prabhupada, during this period, you can see the dates here in 1972 and 1975. Yeah, I'm not going to read word for word. Prabhupada responding very strongly to requests from sannyas for sannyas, making this point that it cannot be done whimsically. That if you've taken a wife, if you have a wife, you cannot abandon your wife, you cannot abandon your children whimsically. You have to take responsibility. In fact, sannyas presupposes responsibility. So Prabhupada does this interesting thing where he flips it around and he says, I cannot give sannyas to any devotee who has not proven himself to be responsible. So if you really want to show you're ready for sannyas, it's almost like counterintuitive. Be the best Narayana that you can be. And then show your responsibility, show your commitment. Right? It's such a contrast to, unfortunately, the way that this toxic masculinity played out. Okay. I want to, again, open it up for some discussions and conversation around we talk a lot about the past, but how does it show up in our current contemporary communities? How have you noticed this play out in different ways? So we have a light for you.
Thank you, Prabhu, for sharing everything. I don't want to sound controversial or something, just sharing it in everything. Like, Prabhu, we started saying, a few Matajis, sometimes we call Matajis or Prabhus. So the question is, because of the different cultural norms and or because of the different parts of the world, one place women are addressed as Matajis, the other place women are addressed as Prabhus. Now, men who haven't seen this or who see the difference, they just see it, it's just different for them. And then to be calling Matajis as Prabhus is just a different thing. That does not mean they have no respect. They have full respect. But those men are seen to be as toxic, with toxic masculinity by those women. That, hey, this man cannot call me a Prabhu. That's not the case. But I've seen those women thinking that these men have toxic masculinity. It's just that it's their different culture. They haven't seen women to be called as Prabhus. So this is, we see so many different approaches in different parts of the world, and why we don't have a standard of how do we call address women as Matajis or Prabhus, whatever the standard is. We want to give them full respect, however it is required. And then this was one question. The other question, off late we saw one of the Matajis giving sannyas. She gave diksha. She became a sannyasi, and she became a diksha guru.
Yeah, that is sannyasi.
Yes, I call it sannyasi. Sorry. Yeah, that was sannyasi. I'm sorry. So she became
No, that some people are saying that's absolutely.
Yeah. So she became a diksha guru, and a few devotees told me this was long awaited. This had to happen, and finally this is happening. Very good. And a few conservative people, or the other side of people would say, well, that never happened in the time of Prabhupada, so why is it happening now? So, for newcomers, like I mentioned before, they don't want to be called as toxic masculinity, but they need clarity of thoughts of what's happening and how it should be.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not going to address the specific content of those two issues because I think they require a lot of time and nuance to get into that. And, this is stuff that's actively being discussed by bodies like the GBC and the Shastra Advisory Board or Council. But what I will say is, in terms of this point of, right, there can be very, I sympathize with the concern that we not just what I'm hearing is we not just label something toxic masculinity just because it's proposing a more conservative viewpoint or it's questioning something language of Mataji and Prabhu or whatever. So I respect that point. And I think as men, again, we're about taking responsibility for ourselves, right? So it's an invitation, I think, for each one of us as individuals to say, okay, whatever's going on at the GBC level or this level or that level, let me take some responsibility to better understand where is this person coming from, right? Now, I imagine you're from an Indian background, so I'm also from an Indian background. I was born and raised in America, so I kind of have a bit of a mixed thing going on. For me, culturally, I feel a resonance with the idea of respecting a woman. The word Mataji carrying so much respect, and also it's so eye-opening to learn the history of how that word has, just as words do, in the history of ISKCON, has morphed and evolved and been used and weaponized in certain ways. And I have not been the recipient of that weaponization, right? It's never been used against me. So it's easy for me to say, oh, Mataji is a fine term in my body. It's harder for me, but it takes more responsibility for me to learn a little bit of the history and to go, okay, well maybe this is where that hurt and that history is coming from. Because the word Mataji has been used, and it's documented, has been used in the exact opposite way of what it was intended. It's been used to demean, it's been used to demarcate, it's been used to separate, or there are places where they said, devotees over here, Mataji's over here. what does that convey? Right? Literally, the body's over here, Mataji's over here. So when you have, so I can sympathize with you again, and at the same time, all I can really say is I want to invite all of us to take personal responsibility and accountability to try to learn our own history and to appreciate with empathy where some of this, where some of the story behind the story is coming from. Because it's not just about the word Mataji, it's about, it's really about like a history that goes with it. Right? But it's a good conversation that I think we should have more of. In the interest of time, I do want to move along. And we got a little bit of a late start. Can I go below and past 6?
I'm going to dominate this discussion.
Get in.
It's pretty aggressive.
Since you asked in such an aggressive manner.
Sorry, I meant to say I'm going to be going overtime. Deal with it. All right. We've kind of naturally come to the third point, and this is often the point that we're not going to do justice to it because it's a subject all unto itself. In fact, there is a wonderful volume, and I really want to recommend that if you have an interest in learning this history and seeing perhaps with newfound empathy some of the story behind the story, there's a volume. Someone helped me out with the title. I think it's called "The Emergence of Women's Voices in Islam." Does that sound right? You wrote the forward to it.
Yeah, there's 2. That's one.
That's one of the other ones. Things called "Show Prabhu's Daughters."
Is it like a bond of love or something? Bond of love.
Say it again.
A bond of love.
Bond of Love. That's it. Bond of
Yeah, it's
Love.
like a weird side book.
Would it be possible to have a reference list that could be sent out like email later on?
Great idea. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. Yeah, just please remind me to I'm gonna do that. But I really want to recommend this volume to it. The one that I want to recommend, it's like oddly sized, and it's called The Emergence of Women's Voices in Islam. It's a collection of essays. I just want to look forward to it. It's a collection of essays over the years, I think from 1990, maybe the first essay, or 91, all the way to 2020. And a lot of what I drew from this presentation actually comes from there. So I'm not going to do justice to this piece, but I want to recommend that if you're interested in this topic, it's worth the read. It's a difficult read. It's really a difficult, painful read. It's an eye-opening read, but it's worth it to hear from women in their own voices what they have experienced. This is not just a few troublemaking, this is not just, those feminists with the agenda, This is, by and large, the experience of our mothers, sisters, daughters, nieces, dear friends, and fellow devotees on the path. So I'm not going to do justice to this piece, but I do want to talk about it a little bit. Misogyny, which literally means a hatred of women, as a category, as a gender. What toxic masculinity does is it works sort of in concert with misogyny and chauvinism, sexism. And what it does is it normalizes. It normalizes misogyny to the point where we may not even consider it misogyny. We may hear that word and go, oh, another term the feminists are throwing at us, but because we internalize this, we become so normalized, so desensitized to it. So what are some examples in our movement's history, again, going real quickly? Physically displacing women being in the back of the temple. I have to share this, Lakshmi and I were talking about this, and I'm not a subject matter expert, but I do come from a Hindu-American background, and I do work with the Hindu community in terms of my job. So I have some experience in the broader Hindu world, in India and America. Often, the justification given for the shift that happened in many Islam temples, and maybe continues to this day, of rather than going side by side in a temple, for men to be in the front for things like darshan and arati, and for women to be in the back, the justification that's often given is that it's truer to Vedic culture. It is, in my experience and my understanding, it is rarely to never do you see that in any temple outside of Islam. In any other Vaishnava temple, in any other Hindu temple of any sampradaya, anything else connected to Vedic culture. In fact, you often see quite the opposite. You see women are not very shy at all about going right up to the, right? So, but at a certain point in our movement's history, we still see this, there's literally the physical displacement of women being put to the back, of women being sent out of the temple room to chant japa in stairwells and closets and sidewalks, so that the men could be unagitated while chanting their japa in the temple room. This is a real history. Or having their services taken, when we talk about leading kirtan, giving classes, and Prabhupada himself would have women give classes in his presence. He would ask Yamuna to speak, he would ask Vishaka to speak, he would ask Malati who would speak. Offering artis, again with this reasoning of it's sort of not Vedic enough. Men taking credit or being given credit for seva done by women. Women having their access to deities and to guru restricted. And then literally, and this is interesting, literally women being erased from the narrative. When I say literally, here are two examples of it. I'm not, again, I have a lot of deep respect and appreciation for the Prabhupada Lamrita as one of the foundational life-changing books that I read. But in several instances, women are literally written out of the narrative. So there's descriptions given of these couples that Prabhupada sent, and in some instances, the operable right, Mukunda, Gurudas, Shyamsundar, and their wives. It's a small point, right? Well, what does that communicate again? Not just to those women, but to women in general in our devotional communities. Are they seen? Are they represented? Do they exist? Here's a really striking example, and if you know more about this, you can afterwards clue me in if I'm getting something wrong. I've only been to Mayapur once personally, but from what I've read and heard, when the Pushpa Samadhi, Shogova's Pushpa Samadhi was created, there were these beautiful murals made of Prabhupada's pastimes. And they were made from actual photographs. So it wasn't the artist's imagination, that they were modeled on actual photographs. And for reasons I don't fully understand, but I think has something to do with this, those photographs were altered in such a way that when they became murals, the women were literally edited out of those. So if you look today in representations of devotees, generic devotees, as well as these scenes of Prabhupada's Leela, the women are missing. The women are not there. Imagine what message that sends to my 13-year-old daughter when I take her to Mayapur and I say, this is your spiritual home. I don't see myself in it. What message did that send to those women who were actually there and said, I remember that photograph. I remember that moment is enshrined in my heart, and now I have to look at it in this Pushpa Samadhi, and I'm edited out of it, right? So again, the point is not for us to, we don't have to beat ourselves up about it, but it's an invitation to take up like a really kind of stark look at our own responsibility and accountability as men.
The other picture there, the gold figure, it's true, there's only men displayed outside.
Yes.
And if you look closer, there's kind of a trim which has big kirtan parties. There's no men anywhere except there was a later section on Emerald History, maybe 20 feet, where there's some women. It's kind of hidden back by the pond. The whole rest of it's all men. There's the Grahastas, which was quite liberal, and men in saffron, but no women.
I read a description of this, and, you know, hold this very lightly because it seems almost unbelievable to me, but the author of the paper, who I think was named Karangi, she said she did a count, and there's something like a little over 1,000 men depicted and 8 women depicted. And numbers kind of tell you something, right? Another thing that gets normalized is not just the erasure of women, but the active denigration and mistreatment of women. So this can be in more subtle or gross ways, right? Neglecting Vaishnavi's basic needs. There's one story of prasada served out, and who gets served first? It's all the men. Who gets their seconds, in some cases, before women and children. These are, in many cases, temple resident women and children who are dependent on this prasada for their sustenance, right? This isn't a luxury, this is a need. And or in some cases, just not even a story, right? We talked a little about the name calling, degrading jokes, references to women as not just being like children, but actually being animals. To this point about Mataji being used as a second-class designation. So there's devotees and there's Matajis. There is one author, one of the papers I read, wrote about a Mayapur festival where there was buses upon buses for the devotees, the Prabhus, in other words, the men, to sit comfortably. This was an early Mayapur festival, and there was one bus for all women and children. Like, no one had even done a head count to know if there was any way physically for these women and children to fit in this bus. It was just assumed they're going to figure it out. And that's not just absent-mindedness, the way we're used to kind of, with our Christian movement, you know, we mismatch songs, that old trope. That's actually willful and reckless neglect. That should be disturbing to us. Selectively quoting from Shastra and embellishing rather than nuancing the apparently chauvinistic or problematic passages. Right? So it's one thing for those passages to be there, that's a whole other topic. We're not even getting into that, we're getting into what happens when a male is sitting on the Vyasasana and has an opportunity to approach those statements thoughtfully in a way to support someone's budding faith, and instead uses it, oh, I'm going to double down, I'm going to go deep, I'm going to, like, almost as a sport, and some of us have seen this, where it's like, is the objective to communicate Krishna consciousness, or is the objective to do as much smashing as you possibly can? Oh, Prabhu, you really gave the sauce in that class, right? So we can kind of turn it into almost a sport. Generally being rude, crude, and tough, especially in performative, especially for, again, not to pick on our monastic brothers, but especially those who are outwardly monastics, and where it's like almost like, I can't be seen as being too soft and too much of a gentleman. So I'm going to show my renunciation by just being as kind of crude and tough and rough as possible. And in some cases, physically blocking, pushing, and spitting on women. Real quick, we're not going to go into detail, but misogyny also extends to non-women. So in other words, misogyny, which is the hatred of women, extends and expands to anyone perceived to be feminine in the eyes of the hater, right? And how this is played out for us is, again, as we've already seen, a consistent demeaning of grihastas generally at various points in our movement's history, which hopefully we've gotten better about, but also an attack of particular men, especially grihastas, who are perceived as being allies and advocates of women, or renunciates, who are perceived as being soft on the women issue, and therefore, as one critic famously used the term pandering, which actually has a very interesting history if you look at the English word pandering. It has some very dark implications to it. But the idea is these men, are henpecked, are whipped, to use another very crude expression, are pandering, or they themselves are not real men, they're eunuchs, they're queers. I'm not making, I wish I could say I just came up with this fancy of my imagination or something, but unfortunately this is taken word for word from a situation not too long ago, maybe a decade and a half ago or a couple of decades ago, where there were some leaked emails, and these are the words that were used for male devotees who were seen to be favoring or showing too much kindness or too much advocacy on behalf of women. Misogyny, there's a direct line from misogyny to the mistreatment. There's scholarship on this that I can point you towards if you're interested. There's a direct line between misogyny and institutionalized misogyny, and then mistreatment and abuse of children, and also even the subtle idea, especially for male children, that boys need to be toughened up. And without going into detail, many of you know the history better than I do, but practically speaking, so much of the history of the tragedy of Gurukul, abuse in the Gurukul, you can see this idea of we need to toughen these children up, we need to toughen these boys up, either subtly or in some cases grossly leading to abuse of children. And then of course, again, it's a wide subject, wider topic than we can do justice to, but you often see misogyny go hand in hand with homophobia and the denigration of those LGBTQ, for those who don't know, stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer devotees, kind of a catch-all phrase. It means anyone who identifies with what our tradition would call kriya prakriti, the third nature. So non-heterosexual identity. There's historically been and continues to be a denigration, especially towards more feminine men who are seen as weak and spiritually deficient in some way. So as we wrap up, we talked about this a little bit already, but how do you all see this as, do you see this as happening in your contemporary devotional communities and devotional lives, or do you think this is all just a part of the past and you don't have to worry about it anymore? That's a little bit of a question, you obviously know it. Yes?
I think that generally in all religious
I think that generally in all the religious organizations across history, even in kingdoms and empires, there has been misogyny and chauvinism, and now it's spilling into the Hare Krishna movement, although the roots of the movement and the way Prabhupada and Chaitanya Prabhu led us was not like that. So I think there's a Western influence that is coming in, and also historically, patriarchy has been a thing that all the, even women outside of ISKCON have been dealing with, but also because ISKCON exists in the West, we have to deal with that as well.
Yeah, so I appreciate that point. I also do want to say it again, we don't have time to get into it, but causation is a really kind of tough thing to talk about, because you're absolutely right. Well, I think there is definitely what we might call Western influences. There's, in our movements, history, some influences from the counterculture and from, we sometimes romanticize hippie culture, but there's the dark side as far as things like neglect and irresponsibility and mistreatment. There's a lot of misogyny that was happening in the good old days of Woodstock or whatever too, right? So some of that finds its way into ISKCON. We don't want to absolve the influence from the East either, so it's not just a Western thing. So it's a mix of these influences, and the fact is that it exists for us. And so, as you said, we rightfully said we need to address it. Does everyone have any thoughts about specific instances, either your own personal lived experience or things you've noticed in your devotional communities?
Well, there was one guy, pretty upstanding guy, but then we all found out he was like Johnson's wife a little bit.
He was?
Johnson.
Okay.
Like slapping her around.
Yeah.
I thought I was one of them. No, he was like slapping his wife around, which is terrible. But because of who he is, he got passed. You know, like where I grew up, if you did that to somebody's sister, that's the handicap. And we're supposed to be more elevated than, the guy, the Irish family down the street who gets passed. There's no reason for it.
There is a reason for it, and
not a good one.
Not a good one. Yeah. So again, I think these are larger conversations to have. We're shy, but yeah, there's a real challenge when we see, especially we're supposed to be, as I said, answering to a higher standard, but when we see kind of almost like bald hypocrisy in action. I don't mean bald just because of the shape, I mean just like undeniable, in your face hypocrisy, because why? Because someone has a position, because someone is so and so, someone is whatever, all the justifications and reasons are given. So again, we're not going to be able to do justice, but thank you for reminding us that it's happening in our backyard, so to speak, and we have to wrestle with it. Yes,
I guess one perspective that I have is,
can we get the mic?
should I wait or? I mean, generally speaking, like, our society, they see words like misogyny and chauvinism, at least publicly, we acknowledge like, oh yeah, we shouldn't do that. But where it really comes up is like, personally, like if you're dealing with one person or two people, I mean, people say stuff to me and like, just me, and I'm like, what? People like, you would never say that, like, but and I know they're true. And just one personal experience, back in my brahmachari days, I had a classic in, and it was better safe than sorry, S-A-R-I, stay in brahmachari. I'm guilty.
Clever,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
little cringy, as my daughter might say. Right? But like, yeah, what's, I mean, okay, you can sort of contextualize it, and again, we're not going to like
Yeah.
beat ourselves up too much, but there's something to think about when you think about what's implied there. I want to just bring up what might be seen as a very minor instance of misogyny that I experienced in my, in my own life and my family experience. And again, not to say that it's, I don't want to make a huge deal out of it, but I want to help us to think again a little bit. The big gross stuff is easy to sort of point out, especially when it's out there or it was back in the 70s or 80s, right? The harder stuff is like, oh, what was it like wearing that button, or what's it like in that one-on-one conversation, or why does this guy get a pass? And so I have had, I tend to speak, give classes, this and that, go on people's podcasts and make a fool of myself, stuff like that. So sometimes I recognize, and often what will happen is I will be in a temple setting, and let's say I'm attending a morning program, and the devotee making the announcement, who's almost invariably male at most temples, will welcome me by name and not mention anything about my family, or if they mention, they'll just say, and he's here with his family. And my wife is someone may if you know her, if you know Krishna Bhakti personally, she is a very, by nature, she's a shy person, she's not a public speaker, she's totally fine, like not being in the spotlight. But she has told me actually how her experience of that is, and she talks about, and she uses words like feeling erased, or feeling, not seen, not present. So it's just something, for us to think about. I really like this quote. I want to share this quote. This is from a scholar named Kim Knott, who's done some excellent scholarship on women in ISKCON particularly. And is a very sensitive scholar, although not a devotee herself, and very sensitive to the view of practitioners. And this is what she writes. She says, the woman problem in ISKCON is everyone's problem. It damages the family unit. In other words, misogyny damages the family unit. Now the most common living arrangement among ISKCON devotees. It threatens the future of the broader community of devotees, and it cripples spiritual progress of all individuals, female and male. And I want to just close, I want that to bring us to our final point, and that is the internalized toxicity of toxic masculinity. So this is a little bit different. This is less about misogyny and the harm we do out there, especially the harm we do to women and children and other men. But this is more the harm that we do to ourselves and the harm that we hold in ourselves. And this is that toxic masculinity derides expressing our emotions. This is the stoicism. The showing of vulnerability or seeking help. And it labels these things unmanly. And it makes us fear that if we are revealed to have feelings, to have emotions, to have weaknesses, to have struggles, that we are outing ourselves as unmanly. Can never show that face, particularly to one another. And as we talked about, what does that do in terms of internalizing, in terms of all that stuff building up inside of us? What does that do in terms of our own mental and emotional health? What does it do in terms of our wholeness as persons and being honest and authentic in our practice of bhakti? So there's internalized social pressure to live up to notions of manhood, right? Men are supposed to be like this. What if I'm not? I made that joke about the big raucous kirtan, but actually there's a kernel of truth in that, because I'm not a kirtaniya, and not only am I not a kirtaniya, but truth be told, I don't actually like those styles of kirtans. And especially as I get older, I definitely don't like that style of kirtan. But there's so much social pressure, and that's just one minor event. There's so much social pressure. Yeah, that was amazing. I loved it. Why? Because I don't want to be looked at as weak, as feminine in front of my peers, my male peers. So there's all these, there's those pressure to live up to notions of manhood. One place I see this, again, these are minor things, but they're insidious. Let's look out for them. It's like that better safe than sorry pin that I'm always going to remember as the example of the. There has become something of a trope, and I've seen this from across the board, from speakers who are from America, from India, from Europe. But there's become a trope of sort of telling marriage jokes from the dasa. from the Justice Fund? Well, there's sort of a comedy routine from the Justice Fund thing happening anyway. That's an interesting trend. But the style of humor, and I'm all for using humor. I don't do it so well all the time, but I'm all for using humor. But the style of it is often in the vein, as one of my dear friends who's a professional comedian, Prabhu, some of you know, as he explains it, it's kind of the vein of this like old-fashioned kind of corny, like, take my wife, please. This kind of humor. Are you familiar with this? Where it's like, the shtick is to always sort of poke fun at your wife, and oh, marriage is the most horrible thing, and like, you know, there's all these little things of like, how I was so much better off before I was married, and now like my life is so terrible, and right? And it's played for laughs, but it also is sending that message that that's what it means to be a man. It means I have bad on my family situation. It means I can't admit that right now I'm missing my wife like anything, and I'm already looking forward to going back home on Sunday and reuniting with her. It means my dear friend Aksh, I'm gonna help you as someone who is away from his 2-year-old.
Yeah,
2-year-old son and wife for the first time in years, ever, from your son. It's like we were on a plane together. He was already like, I'm so guilty to be away from them. That's the reality that many of us feel, and that the performance is, so relieved to be free of the ball and chain. It's kind of lame. It's kind of like a lame, antiquated form of humor that somehow continues to persist in Islam. It's not safe to admit weaknesses or ask for help, and what ends up happening is we end up muting, and in some cases, I'm going to use a strong word, killing our own femininity, our own feminine side. Because theologically we understand that actually, although we may be in male bodies, and so masculine energy pervades our male bodies and our minds, and our subtle bodies, our minds, and intelligence, maybe more so than women, we also have feminine traits, just as women also have masculine traits. And when we artificially negate and kill that feminine side because it's the source of embarrassment, the source of hatred, it's a source of weakness, and I need to hide it, we're actually doing such damage to ourselves. How are we going to, as one of my teachers likes to say, how are we going to soften our hearts enough for Krishna to come and steal them if we are pushing down our feelings and killing that soft, wonderful, feminine side? And then there's that pressure to man up, to suffer in silence and shame rather than to reach out for help. I thought maybe it's fitting to give kind of the final word here to someone I consider a real role model and just an amazing and thoughtful devotee, someone you know, for Vishaka Devi. And when I read this quote, it just, for me, it just crystallized so much the need to cultivate healthy strength, healthy silence, the need to cultivate a kind of a balanced, respectful, wonderful integration of the masculine and the feminine so that Krishna does show up as the strength of the strong, so that Krishna is there in the magic of that confidential, held silence. Who would you do us the honor of read this final quote for us?
Overemphasis on masculine qualities. No, thank you.
Overemphasis on masculine qualities such as rational analysis, authority, control, competition, and power causes us both, men and women, to demean the softness, simplicity, and weakness of the feminine. By neglecting and denigrating these gentle and humbling aspects in each of us, by making the feminine seem trivial, our lives become progressively more rigid, sterile, inert, and empty. We unconsciously allow authority to eclipse feeling, prestige and adoration to eclipse warmth and authenticity. Vishaka Devi.
So this is what I would love to leave us with, and to pose as a kind of a challenge. And I do want to end on a slightly more hopeful note. We need to confront the wound. We need to deal with the stinging of, and for those of you who came in later, you missed an analogy that I offered here, so I'm referring to that. But we need to address the wound, confront the wound. We need to clean the wound, even though it stings and it hurts in a moment. But the hope is that as we do that, real healing can happen. And so I want to invite us again, and I'll share I'll share this slide with anyone who wants, but I want us to think about those 4 sort of locations of toxic masculinity and how in each of those spaces, what can we do collectively as men coming together as we have for this weekend, but also individually in those one-on-one conversations where it's so much easier to just let it go. But maybe there's an opportunity to speak up there, say something. Maybe not, I don't know, every situation. But individually, what can we do to usher in healthy masculinity, to usher in a healthy integration of the masculine and feminine, and to usher in real strength?